Right. Can everyone hear me all right? Welcome to day 2 of Interchange. My name's Jonathan Mosley. I'm an Executive Director at CBRE, and I lead our infrastructure practice across the UK business. I'm delighted that CBRE is here to sponsor and host the Places Hub. There's a very clear interplay between infrastructure, land, property and place. And I was absolutely delighted yesterday to stay to hear Andy Burnham's little slot at the end, because he teed the Places Hub up absolutely perfectly. And I promise you, I didn't write his script and I didn't bribe him, but I couldn't have done a better job if I had done. So to quote him, he said, "Transport is nothing without the places around it." He said that we need a place-based approach to transport planning. He talked about the critical need to find ways to capture land value uplift, and he talked about building over and around stations. So what a perfect segue into today's session. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're sponsoring this hub, because we wanted to help to develop the conversation and to bring into the conversation voices of real assets investors, developers, and placemakers, because we think they just need to be part of that narrative around the infrastructure sector. And we've got a great lineup of sessions and speakers. You're going to hear from institutional investors, government funders and financiers, developers, important regional bodies and major city councils, development corporations, and then a range of expert advisors, including several senior CBRE colleagues of mine. Infrastructure is clearly recognised as a driver of socio-economic growth, regeneration and sustainability. And as the National Infrastructure Commission reports, the government fiscal remit is for public investment of 1.1 to 1.3% of GDP into economic infrastructure over 2025 to 55. But NIC's analysis for the second National Infrastructure Assessment points to the need for investment to increase from 55 billion a year over the last decade to 70 to 80 billion per year in the 2030s and 60 to 70 in the 2040s. So that presents clear challenges for us in terms of funding, financing and delivery. But it's a challenge that all of us in the sector need to rise to. And as the NIC points out, it's that level of investment that's needed to support economic growth and sustainability. There's a very clear role for private sector in financing and delivery, and there's some great examples of how creative thinking and structuring can attract multi-billion pound private finance, even into high-risk schemes, and the Thames Tideway Tunnel is a real example of that. But achieving that's critically dependent on government underpinning to achieve a bankable proposition to investors and lenders. So look, I'm looking forward to a really rich discussion today on a range of very highly topical issues. We're going to be thinking about things like, what are investors looking for in terms of opportunities? Is the so-called wall of money we hear so much about actually the wrong type of money when it comes to financing capital schemes as opposed to acquiring developed assets? We're going to see and hear how investors view the UK market versus other markets as an investment opportunity. Do major changes in government policies, such as the ones we've seen on HS2, affect investors' views and appetites? We'll hear about how government can support funding and help to crowd in private finance. We'll hear about how public-private partnerships can play a key role. We'll think about how we might address the housing challenge, particularly affordable homes. We've got a really good session on how data and digital strategy can help to optimise development schemes, and how public sector real estate value can be unlocked to help fund infrastructure development. So look, that's enough from me. We're going to get started with the first session. I'm delighted to have Daryl Murphy with us, Managing Director of Infrastructure Debt at Aviva Investors. I can't think of anyone better than Daryl to come and give us the institutional investors' viewpoint. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you. Just move this on. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Jonathan, for the kind words. Thank you, CBRE, and I think great initiative in supporting this. I'm perhaps like many investors in our sort of ivory towers in London, probably don't get out enough, probably certainly don't get out outside of the M25 enough. So it's very good to be here and really get a feeling and get a sentiment of what's going on, and particularly around the debate how we move forward, particularly improving infrastructure at a local and national level. So my role today is just give you a bit of an outline around investor appetite, and hopefully it will start to address some of Jonathan's points. So firstly, I don't want to make a bit of advertisement, but what do we do? This is not about Aviva per se. Luckily, most of you probably heard of Aviva if you watch TV, or obviously actually we're now proud to support the Arts Centre now in Manchester, you'll be aware of. But certainly, we and I sit within Aviva Investors where we manage investments and obviously my area into infrastructure. But the point I want to bring across, if you stand back, and this is not an Aviva thing, this is a sort of institutional investor point of view, the diagram just shows that in the middle here where I sort of sit in that fund portfolio manager, we're making investments into, in my case, infrastructure. So far so good. But where's that money coming from? And the reality is that, we've got lots of complex fund structures, but at the end of the day, if you go through possibly other institutions, a lot of what we're investing is money that's coming from pension fund and or insurers, but ultimately that money is coming from the likes of people in this room. So we're investing obviously heavily for, actually it can be for pensioners, particularly in terms of annuities, but also how people are building up their pensions over time. So fundamentally, and it's a very good mindset to have, is that, certainly for my teams, they need to focus on the money they're investing is not some sort of mythical corporate capital. It does belong to, we're making returns back into society. And the point I'm making here also is, I think there's a thing that's really missed, particularly around private investments into infrastructure. It's a virtuous circle. So those individuals are investing, and hopefully we're making them a better return for their later life. But equally, we're improving the infrastructure in and around their own society. So, that I don't think, and this gets missed because, of course, can get quite political, and there's the sort of, end of the day, there are people that make money through this flow. But fundamentally, there's a positive element about any money that privately is invested from institutions is coming from, ultimately, in many cases, UK pensioners or people saving for their pension. So that's a sort of big picture. So let's go to, why invest in infrastructure? Hopefully I don't need to really go over this in great detail for everyone here. Look, I won't sort of pitch to you in from an investor point of view. Obviously, infrastructure is a very long-term, stable sort of income. Obviously, it has this, in many cases, connectivity towards government policy or support. And the most important thing to say is it's a very resilient asset class. So for an investor, people do like infrastructure in terms of its long-term returns, and also the fact that it's very resilient. If you go through some of the challenges we've had, whether it be financial crisis, COVID, etc., infrastructure always fares well, and isn't always related to GDP growth either. Certain assets are, but many of them obviously are sort of counter-cyclical. So from an investor point of view, it's attractive financially. That is important. People still do want returns, so let's not pretend otherwise. But the most important thing is it's a win-win, because investing in infrastructure for investors increasingly aligns to their ESG. I don't know why I put ESIG, actually. But really in terms of ESG and sustainability credentials. Okay, and this is increasingly important in terms of sustainability, but also, and very relevant to today, it aligns to economic growth, communities, and social impact. So when we're investing, it's not just about the environment, which is very important, sustainability, net zero, but also the impact we're having on our community. And the social and ESG is becoming increasingly important. So for many investors, that's why infrastructure is a win-win. As I say, good risk and return financially, but equally having a clear purpose. Now, I always say, if there's one thing, and probably Jonathan and Jeremy perhaps will laugh at this, from time-honoured fashion, I'm going to talk about the classic conundrum of funding and financing. If anyone's ever heard me speak, you may have heard this before. But also, if you want to take one thing away today, if you just take this away, the rest of it you can kind of just forget if you like. In terms of the funding and financing, I live in a like most, particularly talking to many engineers, we all live in a world where we sort of surround ourselves with jargon, and that's a barrier to entry. Finances are no different because I will tend to use funding financing often interchangeably. Formally, they're different. And what's the relevance of this? This is Jonathan's point that in the right-hand side, I am allegedly part of this wall of capital. And it's true. I mean, I have more money to invest than opportunities, okay, in the UK. I can't find enough opportunity to invest. It's a very competitive market. There's a lot of institutions, bank capital, and that may be a surprise to some. Obviously, there's a role of government intervention, and we're going to hear from Jeremy at the moment about how government can work alongside private capital. But fundamentally, financing's the easy bit. The difficult bit is who's paying for it. And the news flash, which many of you know, is it's us. So we're all paying for this, right? And we're paying for this on the basis of, broadly speaking, either taxation in various forms, because it can be central, it can be national or local, or levies, which could be specific, or the consumer broadly. And obviously many of our infrastructure investments are supported by direct consumer funding. So consumer, taxpayer, I use as a general mix to describe broad areas of infrastructure. The other area which I put in brown deliberately is land development. This is nirvana, very relevant for, obviously for a lot of conversations, something I speak to Jonathan a lot about. This is nirvana why can't we seem to attract the value from land development into infrastructure? This has been a problem I don't think anyone's really cracked. There are good examples globally. I think the good example we always tend to use is the MTR in Hong Kong, where if you're going to build a subway, put a station and then a sort of office block retail above it, then obviously you're creating huge value. We've struggled a bit in the UK to deliver this, but obviously that is the only real, I would argue, source of value that can come outside from deliberately individuals, whether it be taxation or consumer. And obviously that funding generates, sorry, sounds a bit patronizing, but you see that generates cash flow that supports the financing. So I often find that when I'm speaking to non-investors, everyone likes to focus on this area. Everyone thinks this is the problem. I would say this is not the problem. The left-hand side's the problem. I have literally sat with local authorities and said, I can lend you as much money as you like. The problem is, I don't know how I'm going to get it back. And that's the problem. So as if you've got a clear proposition, how someone investing is going to make a return, then you're actually onto something. But there are too many schemes today where there's a mismatch between these two principles. Okay, that might be a theme that develops later. So what is really going on? I would say, look, the message to me from government is quite clear, I think. We need private capital, this is government speaking, we need private capital to move to net zero, energy transition, and most of private capital is being encouraged into consumer-based infrastructure, meaning energy, utilities, in a broader sense, energy generation, and digital, whether it be fiber, data centers, etc. So these are private markets. Tax-funded infrastructure, the government's kind of said, we don't need private capital, leave that to us, right? That's fine, right? And it's not for me to argue that there's a policy whether we want to use private capital or not. That's not really the point. If the infrastructure gets built, then that's fine, right? My obvious challenge is I'm not sure that's true. So actually, if there's a funding gap, and bearing in mind that the public sector doesn't have an infinite pot, then should we be using private capital more judiciously, particularly how we tie it back to tax-funded infrastructure, by which I mean particularly public transport. Obviously, once upon a time, we had a model which was called, I have to bring it up, PFI PPP. We do love that as an investment. Obviously, it has its detractors. I think we could debate the way the model was implemented, but the principle was clear. It created a cash flow that generated investment. The problem is there is no model. So I would argue I have no route to invest in public transport in the UK. So therefore, what do? Generally this stuff, right? This is where we're really focusing our investments on. And the interesting thing is it's kind of easy-ish to difficult, right? So the interesting thing, if you're in infrastructure at the moment, particularly around net zero and energy transition, is the fact that it's more than just conventional renewables. Everyone wants to talk about hydrogen, battery storage, CCUS. This is the area that's developing, and this will be a big feature of investment going forward, alongside obviously huge investment around fiber and data centers. So that's what keeps us busy. And the last couple of points, I like these two articles, and these are both articles in the FT last year. And I like this because it kind of illustrates the problem we face. The left-hand side, it was kind of a government sort of discussion with a minister, basically saying, UK infrastructure, investors wanted. The government runs around the world trying to convince sovereign wealth funds and other investors to come to the UK because we have this huge infrastructure need. However, another article, UK lacks attractive infrastructure projects, says major investor. That wasn't us, that was IFM, who are Australian, but it's kind of true, right? So that's kind of where I'm sitting, which is, okay, we're trying to find the right opportunities. And obviously over here, the government's saying, well, we need capital. So there's a total mismatch here that's going on, and this is kind of the heart of the problem. But if we look at, net zero, the interesting point about net zero is, post-financial crisis, what was guiding infrastructure was really economic development and growth. And now that's moved on. So I always, in my idle thoughts, I think, what would life be like at the moment if there wasn't net zero? I mean, what would drive infrastructure? It would be back to thinking about productivity and growth. That's kind of been put to one side, and net zero is now the beacon that's driving a lot of our investment. But obviously the problem we have is the pace of delivery still remains too slow. And obviously net zero is too big a topic. So if you break it down to all the various technologies, impact on homes, transport, industry, energy, there's an enormous wealth of opportunity. But it feels to me that we're still, and I get lost in this discussion, but we're sort of lost in terms of the pace of delivery. I think the government's got some good ideas, some good targets, but how we get there is not entirely clear. We'll touch on perhaps later the point about the UK has a number of tools available. It's an acronym soup, but the use of contract for difference and the regulated asset-based model, we'll perhaps touch on later on, but also, dare I suggest, PPP in some form as well. So the UK has been really innovative, I would say, in developing funding financing models. And the point is, how does that evolve further? What's the new model to develop? But there's no doubt that government intervention plays a big role in this, and I'm sure Jeremy will talk to that in a moment. But if there's one thing that's still clear, where Jonathan's spot on, the right money for the wrong, it's either the right money for the wrong projects, but probably it's the wrong money for the right projects, meaning the gap, the market failure, in my view, is at this very early stage of development, whether it be development in transport or regeneration or into early energy technology. The risk profile there is not something where there's a wealth of capital. So again, we need models that can address that. So in conclusion, just take away here, the UK should be one of the most attractive areas for investment. I say this, I mean, a lot of people, I see in government meetings with investors, if they're international, they love throwing out, but, look at IRA, look at the US, I've got other places to put my capital. Truth be told, Aviva has a lot of sterling capital. It needs the UK to be the big market. So we have vested interest. But UK internationally should always be seen as an attractive destination because of our track record and innovation. And that needs to continue. I think infrastructure is a great, robust asset class. A lot of investors want to invest, so the money keeps flowing. The problem is, where's it going to go, right? And we need to balance this demand and supply, because at the moment, there's this pent-up demand for assets. As I've mentioned, net zero is a huge driver. That's all you'll hear if you walk around investors at the moment. But the UK is definitely subdued. I would say we're not quite in the same market. It's all a little jam tomorrow, as it were, if you believe net zero and delivery. Our role collectively is to make this happen quicker. And that gets to the really less exciting but important topics around planning, consenting, grid connections, etc., etc. My last point, being slightly political but not really, is the election's coming. Elections are normally a bad thing for infrastructure because obviously you're aware it just slows everything down. The only comment I make, and as opposed to 2019, is that we feel positive because I don't think there's a huge difference between the two main parties who are likely to, well, there's always, you can argue perhaps there's only one party that's likely to win, but in terms of the two main parties, they're not that far apart in their policy and goals. The pace and ambition might be slightly different, but they're not hugely different in terms of infrastructure investment, and that's a good thing. So it feels to me that, actually generally everyone is pushing the same direction. So that's what I wanted to say. Hopefully it's giving you a little bit of perspective and we can build of that as we go forward. I've had my time. I'd like to hand over to Jeremy Barker. It's UK Infrastructure Bank. Jeremy will give a little bit of an outline as what it does. Very pleased to welcome Jeremy on board. Jeremy and I, and in fact Jonathan, used to be colleagues as well, so there is a bit of a connection. So without any further ado, over to you, Jeremy.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for the setup, Daryl. What's the government doing about some of this stuff? So here we are to talk about the infrastructure bank. I will apologise in advance if my voice goes a bit. My football team that I went to watch last night won its first game in 17 games yesterday, and I got rather carried away. So I need to apologise to people that are familiar with the UK Infrastructure Bank because this is going to be an introduction to the bank, but I think it's very helpful to go through exactly why we exist, because it plays into some of the points that Daryl's just made. How do we get financing unlocked when funding is an issue? How do we crowd in private investment from a government perspective? And the Infrastructure Bank itself is a relatively new institution. Our chief executive describes us as trying to fly a plane while we're still building it, and we are still building it. So just to give you an idea of that, I joined in April last year. I've been there, 10 months. I think I was the 20th person in the banking team. We're now up to 70 staff, so that just gives you an idea of the scale of growth. And whilst the banking team is now, I would argue, fully functioning, other bits of the bank to support that are still recruiting. So apologies if we're a little bit slower than people hoped. So who are we? Well, we're wholly owned by the Treasury, and we were set up for two principal aims. The first is to support the transition to net zero, and the second is to support regional and local economic growth. Levelling up and net zero, in other words. We focus on 5 priority sectors. You can see them there: energy, transport, waste, water, and digital. I think importantly, where you can see where we sort of fit with the other government institutions. We're not there to support the research and development, brand new startup businesses, which is more Innovate UK. British Business Bank kicks in. We're there to support mature and maturing markets. And we're able to provide all sources of capital. So unlike previous Treasury-sponsored schemes, we can provide debt, we can provide equity, we can provide guarantees. We are set up to crowd in investment, and I'll come to our 4 criteria that we measure ourselves by in a minute. We also have a local authority arm, so we have an advisory team that will help advise local authorities, and we can lend directly to local authorities. And interestingly, we're cheaper than the Public Works Loan Board, so we are just 40 basis points above gilts. We don't provide revenue guarantees. When we provide a guarantee, we typically guarantee other lending to reduce the cost of capital for that lender. We don't provide grants. And we do provide equity, but we don't yet take controlling equity, and there's a reason for that. I think it's partly because of the expertise in the team we've got, but also the resourcing to sit on boards making decisions on an active basis. So we're much more of a silent silent investor at the moment. So how much have we got? We've been given £22 billion, probably one of the best funded startups in history. But that's split between 8 billion of cash for debt and equity, 10 billion of guarantees, and 4 billion for local authority loans. And we have 4 bottom lines, unusually to most banks, and Darryl will have an ESG target and will have other sort of vaguer targets, but fundamentally a lot of private sector investors are driven by profitability. We are driven by profit. We're a commercial organisation. We have independence from Treasury, and we do have to make money, but it's not the be-all and end-all. We have 3 other objectives. The first is supporting net zero. So for all of our projects, we have a policy and impact teams who will assess, is this a sort of project from a net zero capability that we should be supporting? We also look at that regional and local economic growth angle. In fairness, most of the projects we've done today have ticked both boxes. We're also tasked with crowding in. So what does that mean? It means that we should be taking a position that helps other institutions join in the transaction. So what we won't do is a transaction, let's say there's a deal that's got 20 banks and they want to just get another bank on board. We won't join that deal because it's clearly there's enough banks out there that are interested in the transaction. We might do that if the transaction was so large that actually they couldn't get the last bank, and that obviously helps enable that transaction to happen. But where we try and get involved is to make a project more attractive to other investors. So what does that mean? It might be using our guarantee product. It might be providing some sort of first loss piece so that we take more risk than other lenders, protecting those other lenders and therefore encouraging them to invest. We have a product which is similar to the European Investment Bank, which was called the Public Bonds Credit Enhancement, I think. And we have a similar product, and the idea of that, let's say a project costs 100, and you're worried about cost overruns, we might provide a 20 million support facility that can be drawn in the event of anything causing those cost overruns, which then gets swept through the cash that the project generates to clear it, but it sits there for the project. And again, that is an enhancement that can move up a ratings notch and attract institutional investors. So we've done quite a few deals. I think this is already out of date. We've invested nearly 3 billion of our 22 billion. But importantly, alongside us, we've managed to crowd in 10.3 billion of private capital, and we've created over 7,800 jobs. I won't go through each of those here, but I think it's quite interesting because some of the things we've done have raised a few eyebrows in the market. So some of them, you might say, Jeremy, these sound a little bit like deals that you talked about where you wouldn't just be another bank. So an example of that is we did the interconnector project between the UK and Germany, electricity interconnection. Actually, that was quite an interesting project because we committed to lend just shy of 50% of that transaction. In the event, partly through our involvement, lots of other banks came in and we got scaled back to 30% and then got scaled back to 15%. We then had a debate internally, should we pull out of this transaction altogether? We're clearly not needed. We didn't pull out for a couple of reasons. One, we'd spent a year working on it and we wanted to get some revenue. But actually there were some overseas banks, particularly Japanese banks, who'd seen the UK government bank involved, and that was quite important for their credit decision. So a good example of crowding in. But we're also prepared to take more risk. So if you look at some of the transactions that we've done, for example, the one I think that raised most eyebrows, we've invested equity in a Cornish lithium mine. So mining in it is risky at the best of times, but trying to stimulate the growth of lithium mining to support the EV charging market. We've also invested equity in a hydrogen aeroplane developer. I can't remember what they're called. And we've done a rewilding project. So we supported an organisation to buy an estate, several thousand hectares in Scotland, specifically to improve the environment there. And here's some of the local authority deals we've done. We are called the UK Infrastructure Bank for a reason. We do have debates internally. So, for example, our hydrogen plane manufacturer, some of the plane sales may well go overseas. So is that a UK story? Well, the manufacturing and the research and development's happening in the UK, so we concluded that was okay. But we have turned down businesses where we just felt the angle for the UK was too small. We are UK, the whole of UK, so we cover Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and in fact, we've just announced, I think we've got 2 of the 3 offices open, one in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland, and the Wales. We're just recruiting a business development person for that area. And I won't dwell on that. You can see the map there in the slide. I'm not going to dwell on this particularly, but I think it's quite important. We're headquartered in Leeds. We can't be a levelling up bank if we're based in the southeast, so we've recruited into Leeds. There was a lot of criticism at the Public Accounts Committee about, well, can you get the people with the relevant skills up in Leeds? Well, we've got a very experienced board. We've got a very experienced exco. We're very proud of our diversity. Our chief executive used to be the global chief executive for HSBC. Our head of banking used to have a very senior role at Lloyds Bank. We've got people who know what they're doing. And I think that's quite important. I've just put this one up as well, just in case you spot me, but also I think it's quite helpful because whilst we had those 5 priority sectors, which I will try and remember again, clean energy, transport, digital, waste and water, each of the people you see on that screen has a sector specialisation. My particular sector focus is retrofit, which I confess I had to Google when I joined the bank, but I now am an expert in after 10 months. And what has been fascinating for me is just how much of a stir we've created in the market. I'm used to having a mixture of deal execution and trying to win the next deal. I joined in April last year. I have had over 80 projects approach me just in the retrofit sector, and if you multiply that across all of the directors there, you'll see how busy we are, and even with a team of 70, we're struggling. We're having resources discussions about how we keep working. We're having to expand the office as well. We're moving, still in Leeds, but having to double the office capacity. I'm going to stop there, I think. Those are our headline achievements. They were on some of the other slides. I won't dwell on that. And I think I'm handing over to Simon from CBRE. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to start with an apology as well. I wasn't cheering on my football team. I support Chelsea, so I seldom cheer them. But it's just that time of year where everyone's got colds and snuffles and everything like that, so apologies in advance. The theme of this next presentation is about how we at CBRE have gone about securing private investment for a particular infrastructure asset belonging to one of our clients in the southwest. I'm going to go with another apology as well. I was meant to be sharing this platform with Sam O'Dwyer, who's the MD of Cornwall Airport, but she's unfortunately had to go to a board meeting in Truro, which It's completely the other end of the country, and so she can't be here with us today, and there are no direct flights from Cornwall Airport to Manchester at the moment. So, let me start with a bit of an introduction first. I'm Simon Tanner. I'm Head of Asset Transformation at CBRE. I've been with the firm for just about 2.5 years now. I started life as a civil servant in the fast stream, and then moved into PwC in corporate finance, where I spent a lot of time. I always find it heartening when people still talk about PFIs and PPPs, because that's what I started doing. And I'm now working on some of their expiries as well. But done PFIs and PPPs across the globe, so lots in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, where I did the first ever one down there. So I love bringing that kind of public sector and private sector together and actually driving out investments and projects. I think it's really, really gratifying. So today, I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years, working alongside Sam and her team at Cornwall Airport, and also alongside colleagues from Cornwall Council. And what we've been working on, we've been calling it Project Corduroy. It's a code name. It's also called the Cornwall Airport Infrastructure Project, but Corduroy is much more fun. For those of you who are familiar with Cornwall Airport, that's the runway, it actually overlooks my favourite surfing beach at Morganforth, which is just over the heads there. And Corduroy describes perfect surfing conditions. For someone who grew up, I'm a Devonian, but I'm allowed into Cornwall apparently. I grew up surfing in North Devon, and Corduroy is the perfect surfing conditions. It's the perfect aspiration. It's kind of nirvana, second time it's been mentioned today, for a surfer. And so what we're hoping for is perfect surfing conditions for this particular project as well. What we've been trying to do on this project is to attract private sector investment into Cornwall Airport, which we see there, and 4 contiguous sites, which you can see some of, but you can't see all of them, around the airport site. They all belong to Cornwall Council, and they total 653 acres. I think it's probably useful to just frame the whole project and frame what we've been doing and provide a little bit of background and history. So we were first approached by Cornwall Council and Sam's team a couple of years ago, and they were facing a massive dilemma. Having experienced really positive growth at the airport in terms of passenger numbers, and as anybody who's worked in airports, passenger numbers are key because footfall through the airport allows increase in retail and car parking and all the kind of other ancillary things that acts as an engine for growth. They'd had this huge growth, and then the pandemic hit. And Cornwall Airport, like many other airports, probably every other airport in the country and around the world, suddenly faced a huge reduction in passenger numbers. And then as a result of COVID and the subsequent lockdown, it's taken them a long time to recover. They are on the upward trend, but it's still taking a long time. And this meant that the airport required a significant injection of subsidy from the council to keep it running and keep it going. And the subsidy is still needed now, and the subsidy ranges from, it started at about 2.5 million to 3.5 million, it's declining a little bit now. And you've only got to watch the news today. Everyone knows that local authorities are all facing enormous pressure on their budget just to deliver the kind of basic suite of services. So suddenly having to have an additional financial demand placed upon you creates a huge challenge. So our task was to identify a solution that would allow the airport to stay open. This was a must-have because of regional connectivity issues. But to reduce the financial burden on the council. So what do we do and how do we do it? The first thing that we did was just start with a completely clean slate. And, all options were on the table, subject to the fact that we had to keep the airport open. And we assessed a whole range of these options through several different lenses, capturing a series of red lines, which were the council's must-haves, and commercial principles. And these ranged from obviously having to keep the site open, to trying to be some sort of economic stimulus, moving the reliance away from regional jobs and horticulture and agriculture to proper long-term sustainable jobs, and to try and increase the economic prosperity of the area through increasing the average wage, which in that particular part of the country is very, very low. We also needed to look at how we preserved the economy and the environment, so we couldn't just suddenly create some sort of huge nuclear processing plant there. And also, fundamentally, not sell the site. And the council wanted to try and keep some sort of interest so that they could generate revenue from the site as well. And we were quite lucky that Cornwall Airport's got a lot going for it. It's the 7th longest runway in the country. It's attracted a host of really favourable publicity when we had G7 there and all the heads of state were flying in there for the G7 in Cornwall. And in addition, it currently holds the only horizontal space launch licence in the country. So it's got a bit of a unique selling point. And then as part of our review of the site, we started to look at what bordered the site. And so there's the spaceport, which is great, but it also included a massively underdeveloped EU-funded, or part EU-funded, Aero Hub Business Park, which has some development on it, but not a lot, and hadn't been marketed particularly aggressively. There's the Kernow Solar Farm, which is also owned by the council, and also some other 300 acres of developable land, which again, owned by the council. And part of the issue that we faced was none of the people in the council were talking to each other. So you had the airport, which is a separately owned company run by Sam, but owned by the council. Then these other bits, the business park, the solar farm, all part of the same mass, but nobody actually figured out that you could join the dots. So our first thought was, well, let's join all these disparate elements, get people actually talking to each other, and create a rather more holistic parcel, and trying to create some sort of virtuous circle of investment based around developing the business park and the spaceport, which would then generate additional revenues and demand at the airport. The solar farm provides some sort of steady state income, and the developable land would allow any potential investment partners further scope to develop out the site. And then we looked at what those themes might be. So what would attract an investor into the site? The airport doesn't have a freight license, so logistics was out of the question. And anybody who's ever sat on the A30 going from Cornwall back into the rest of the UK will know that the roads and road connectivity is pretty limited. So then we looked at other areas that could make the site unique and saleable and different in a market which I think you need to find that kind of like uniqueness for projects. And the key factor for us was the spaceport and the launch facilities there. So we explored options with working with satellite technology, because satellites are very fragile. So if you can actually ship a satellite into the airport, you can work on it there, you can launch it from there, there's no travel and no transport, which suddenly means that there's less scope for breaking a satellite. And you can launch jumbos from the airport. So that's what will get your satellites up into space. And so we looked at creating a science cluster, linking into academia, such as Exeter University and Truro and Falmouth colleges, and bringing all that together. So you've got people looking at satellites, looking at rocket technology, looking at engine testing. And then we considered other anchor options like tourism, which is just, it's a bit vanilla for Cornwall. There's a lot of tourism going on there. So the space one was the one that really started to get everybody excited. And then as we began to tease out these options, an important part of developing that whole site-wide solution was getting the council team involved, making sure, because as I said, there's disparate stakeholders. So we tried to bring all of them together with the principle of no surprises, regular engagement. And I'm sure if Sam was here today, she would echo that sentiment, that having that shared vision and shared goal has been really critical just in getting the public sector side on board with us. So that we've got this unified vision, unified objective right the way across all stratas, from the officials right up to the leader of the council. Everyone's kind of pushing behind it, which I think is really, really important. But having a holistic site-wide vision is one thing, but without an investment partner, it all kind of becomes a bit pointless and falls away. And in the current market, finding investment partners isn't always easy. I was talking to an investor yesterday, and he described the market to me as being dull and illiquid, with huge gaps between valuations and very limited confidence. That's not really kind of the market that you want to go into when you're trying to find somebody to take on board this site. So against that commercial backdrop, heroically, we began our search for an investment partner who would be prepared to take on a large subsidy liability and develop out the site and work with a local authority. Not necessarily the most attractive thing that you might think to find an investor. So how did we do it? One of the things we wanted to do was give confidence to people that this would actually work. So we tried to create the art of the possible. So I dwelt back into my old private finance days and created a public sector comparator. So we looked at what could the council do if the council were able to develop out the site, given their relatively limited access to funds. And how would this look over 15 to 20 years? What would the cash flows be? Could it actually happen? And so we had then a baseline. And this gave us a position that allowed us to better understand and nuance the vision, make some subtle tweaks to it, but also to get a better grasp of how we could deliver the growth on the site. And I think this was really important so that when we started talking to potential investors, we weren't going to get laughed out of court with something which just didn't stack up. And I think it's a really key point that if you're going out to the market and if you're trying to attract private finance, you have to be credible and you have to demonstrate that credibility and have to demonstrate that actually you're going out to market with something which is fully baked and not half-baked. So the next part of what we did was around some soft marketing. Having created the vision, having created the public sector comparator, we produced, as consultants always would, a bit of a deck, and then we went around talking to potential investors. So developers, private equity, some airport operators, and this was really useful because it gave us a chance to road test what we were aiming to do, see what their views were, and that allowed us then to, again, come back into the office, talk to our stakeholders, talk to our client group, and say, this is what needs to be done. We need to change this because this will just not be attractive to the market, but this will. And it just gave us a lot more confidence, again, about going out to market. And then, having completed all the soft marketing and done our tweaking and development internally, we then tried to work up a competitive process for the site aimed at getting best value for the council team. And obviously that's really important because whilst we have the objectives of trying to do away with the subsidy and get inward investment, council also have certain statutory obligations, so they're looking to make sure that they get best value. One of the things we encountered was the council's procurement team. And so we were at pains throughout to stress that this was actually a property transaction and not some sort of concession contract where they were going to get really excited and start using the public sector procurement regs. So we managed to not quite swerve that, but avoid having to do that. But a lot of our approach did probably nod to old school procurement, making sure that we ran a process that was robust and fair and transparent, and at the same time observing all the council's governance obligations, of which there are many. So the story so far, where are we now? We got the political go-ahead from the leader of the council in September to launch the competition. And this was the nerve-wracking bit. So we sat there, threw it out through our various different channels, through all sorts of social media and real estate. Well, what if nobody actually responded? Did we have a plan B? What was that plan B? Luckily, we had no need of the alternative plan, and the project generated a huge amount of interest from a really diverse group of investors and developers and operators. We'd issued a market teaser, as I said, just through our various different sort of channels, and then potential partners were able to submit an EOI. We got a whole host of EOIs back. We then assessed and filtered those EOIs to make sure that the people who were actually interested in the project were the ones who could help us deliver it. And that if they had the right credentials, they were admitted into the process. They then had a prospectus and then completed a bid. And so we're now at bid evaluation stage, working through with two really, really robust, good bidders to see where we're going to get to. Oops, I've gone. So where are we now? Final stage of the competitive process. Working with bidders to develop their solutions. All being well, the council should be able to get to a transaction by later this year. That's the goal. But what have we learned? I think the process has taught us that despite the somewhat uncertain nature of the market and the economy, there are still investor partners out there, but you need to work really hard to find them. you need to make a compelling case for them to work with you, and you need to give them confidence that what you're saying is actually what you're going to do. I think there's a further dimension around providing assurance to those partners around working with the public sector body. Certainly when we had bidders in for sessions about last month, the first question both of them asked was, is the council robust? Are they going to go bankrupt? So it's high on everyone's agenda. You don't want to work with a partner that's going to just go belly up. And as with any partnership, there's got to be a true spirit of cooperation and collaboration. And this example is no different. So we've been at pains to make sure that the requirements of the public sector on the one hand aren't overly onerous, and equally that the rewards to the private sector are commensurate with their investment. So it's a proper partnership. The key, from my perspective, has been to ensure that both parties have been pragmatic in what they're doing, and we've sought to achieve that by being really clear throughout the process about what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it, and what the goal looked like at the end, and really keep focused on that end goal. So, as I said, the expectation is that we're going to get to some sort of close by later this year. I'm really excited that we're going to be looking at a new venture being announced that's going to secure long-term economic growth in North Cornwall, which would be amazing. It'll provide new and sustainable employment for the region, which is just essential, and while also removing the burden on the local authority of having to support the airport, which allows them to actually fund the things that they need to fund. It will be a proper partnership of private sector finance with public sector assets. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to hand over to the two Andrews now.
I'll go here. You stole our punchline on the two Andrews. I was going to use that as part of the material. Okay. So look, today we've got a discussion on impact funds and development finance. It's a fireside chat, but we've got no fireside here, have we, Andrew? And he brought his marshmallows, didn't you? He brought a full sack. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, so Andrew McIntosh, I'm the Director of Place at the Combined Authority, so I suppose responsibility in a wider GM sense for housing planning, land, property, infrastructure, delivery and culture. Clearly we've got Transport for Greater Manchester that predominantly deal with transport, so kind of look after everything else. So and Andy's comments at the end of yesterday, probably quite close to where he might be heading on that.
Okay, thanks. So I'm Andrew Antonides. I'm the head of lending at CBRE. We're the lending platform at CBRE, so we partner with a range of public and private bodies. Amongst those public bodies, the North West Evergreen Fund is one of our key lending programs. In terms of scale, we lend about 700 million a year. We've done about 3.5 billion since we set this up 10 years ago. So tremendously proud of what we've achieved. But development finance, impact funds, they're at the heart of what we do. They have been from day one, and 10 years on from setting this all up. I'm still here talking about impact funds, and I'm pleased I'm here talking about impact funds. So that's us. Where should we start things off, Andrew? Should we set the scene on development finance?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And the long journey. Sorry, man, I introduced myself in terms of the current role, but just to wind back slightly, a long history of working with Andrew and the CBRE guys in terms of setting up Evergreen. Actually first joined the Combined Authority over 10 years ago now, working in the core investment team. So actually set up our own housing funds, worked with CBRE colleagues to actually set up Evergreen. So it's been a long drawn out history with a historic experience in infrastructure finance, working with Darryl and Jeremy and Jonathan as well historically. So I think from an impact fund point of view, this has been a long journey, and just I think, really pleased to see the sort of development to date. So
yeah, I'd say bittersweet, I feel bittersweet about things. I'd say, I'm really happy with the amount of conduits that there are that exist today in the market, some of the ones you talked about. But if we look back, the development finance landscape, it hasn't really returned post-GFC, which saddens me. I remember in the early days when, we were doing the first ever green loans, and it was tough trying to, explain to people what we were about, what an impact fund was trying to do. But in the back of our minds, we always thought, we'll be doing senior debt, we'll be doing most of the stack, but that'll be the first year, that'll be the first few deals. And then we'll eventually have to become mezz because all the banks will come back, other people will come back in the market. They'll see this fantastic opportunity that we see, and that hasn't happened. And I say bittersweet because we're having a fantastic time. You know, we're doing interesting transactions. We're all really having a great time. But the wider market, the private sector market, it hasn't come. And I think that's a shame. And that's why you've got great people like Jeremy and all the funding conduits that, you know, that he represents and other ones like it. They have to exist because the private sector hasn't filled that gap. Development finance, there's still a gap. Even all those years after the GFC, it hasn't changed. And look, I understand why, right? You know, for the banks, they should be the main sources of liquidity. It's hard for them to lend, you know. I won't name any because it's not fair, but they're all in the same sort of quandary. Lending to development's hard for them, right? Because they've got regulation, they've got slotting. They put all this money aside to do a development. They're not geared up to really do it. It's better for them to chase the investment. Look at the debt funds. You know, look at the debt funds. So, you know, they're good, they're more entrepreneurial, but they tend to sort of favour London. They don't like getting on a train. I like getting on a train. You like getting on a train. They tend to not come up to outside London so much, and that's a shame. So that restricts the limited amount of development finance liquidity to London, which is a pity. And I could keep going on with factors. You know, you've got the overseas capital, and we're going to come back to that later. I shouldn't admit that because it's not meant to be scripted. But we'll talk about overseas capital later. You know, that hasn't filled the gap either. So, you know, I don't think it will change, do you, Andrew? I don't think it's going to change unless we change it, unless local areas change it.
No, and I think we've seen through peaks and troughs of excitement from a debt market perspective where suddenly actually the market's right and everyone's willing to dip their toe in the water. But the reality is that the liquidity and the depth of the market and opportunities isn't actually that great outside of London. So everyone makes a couple of investments and then suddenly the debt market sort of step back and sit and wonder how quickly actually all these commercial buildings can be filled up and let out. They wonder how quickly the residential blocks can actually be occupied. So there's a sort of, through time, has been a series of small windows where everyone said, you know, in a Greater Manchester context, the city centre is a place to invest, and that's probably been a 4-month, 6-month window where everyone's got excited and then suddenly said, oh, how can we possibly fill, you know, 3,000, 5,000 homes that are currently in the pipeline? And actually what we'll do is we'll wait and see. But of course, a bit like infrastructure, these are long-term plays, so you can't pause for 6 months and then take a view as to what you're going to do because you've got to look 3-4 years out in terms of what demand's going to look like. So I think in my personal view, I think that's the reason that actually we failed to see everyone sort of step into the picture, because as soon as you create the right conditions, there's a couple of transactions, then suddenly everyone sort of steps back from it, which means that there'll be a continual need for flexibility from our point of view and continuing to be innovative and novel in the way that we invest. And I think, you know, working with, you know, the likes of you guys, it's actually going out and speaking to the equity developers that actually do want to deliver in a, you know, in the different locations. And in my world, it's a GM context, but actually, how do we ensure that we've got the right conditions for those people that do actually have equity to invest but provide capital to close the gap that makes the schemes viable?
Yeah. I think that's fair. And I think it's worth a moment to pause as well, right? And just remember, there's a lack of development finance, not because there's a lack of good schemes. There are some fantastic schemes. They're all good, you know, the ones we do. They're fantastic. It's other factors stopping this liquidity, which is such a shame. And you talk about the equity, you know, that you need the equity in the deal to make it happen. And if that's scarce, that's a problem. You know, overseas equity can have a challenge. Again, we won't name any names. It's not fair to do it, but overseas equity can be a bit flighty now and again. You know, they are governed and are ruled by things that happen in their own hometowns. So if something goes wrong somewhere else, let's say, you know, the US, North America, a big capital provider who would be putting liquidity here, say into Manchester, if something goes wrong in Wisconsin, maybe they don't want to carry on with doing other schemes here. And that's a shame. I think it's all these outside forces that can underserve the fantastic development pipelines in key regional areas. That I think is a real sad thing. But you know what isn't sad though, right? What I think is really great, Andrew, is the developer community itself to see through that, especially the local ones who have these great schemes, who don't look at the day-to-day, the year-to-year. They know they've got a good scheme. They know it's the right one for the local economy. They know it will make an impact. They know it's going to deliver. they stick with it and risk their equity, and they have to wait for all the other capital providers to come along and get the right mix, the right lunar eclipse, then it happens.
Yeah, and I think that's changing appetite and debt providers wanting to sort of pay back the leverage that they put into schemes and then just expecting, there is no wall of equity that seems to be coming over the horizon. There's a wall of debt that's quite happy to service a well-structured scheme that's got a nicely structured risk profile from their perspective. But actually, how do we close the gap between what the debt market actually wants to see and what the equity providers are actually able to dig out of their own pockets? And that's not, in a lot of cases, it's not because they actually have the money and don't want to invest. It's because they've got so many opportunities because they believe in the markets they're delivering in. But actually, chasing several projects means that they're then stretching their own capital, and therefore they don't have the deep pockets to go and do more things. But it's that commitment in a local context that actually drives projects forward. But we've got to find a way of bridging that equity gap, which means that actually we can drive forward in the number of houses and commercial developments that we bring forward. I mean, Andy was speaking yesterday. We've got PFE that's just going through the final stages of adoption. 160-odd thousand homes that we've got to build across Greater Manchester in the next sort of 15, 20 years. And actually, if we continue to rely on rather sort of shallow pockets of not a massive pool of developers in a sort of regional context, then we're never going to see that rate of development coming forward that we need to meet the housing crisis, which is looming over the horizon. I think the government thinks there's a quick fix to this, but actually there's a combination of factors that all impact, and the policies that equally have been trying to be brought in, which for the greater good and ones that we support through things like reducing carbon emissions. They are all things that just add to the cost burden of projects where there's already viability challenges and already challenges with sort of value creation through regeneration and development. And we need to be thinking about, alongside infrastructure, we need to be thinking about the long-term value benefits we get from regeneration and taking the risk on, the expected, anticipated growth that we're going to get in the future, and using that as the financing mechanism that, or the funding mechanism that actually we need to repay both equity and debt through the market. But ESG, it's already been touched on by several people. I think it's a good point to sort of segue into, what we're doing in Evergreen and ESG investments.
Yeah, I think it's easy to think about an investment in purely numerical terms, right? What's the return? Has the money been given back? Is it a profitable scheme? At the heart of impact funds, at the heart of Evergreen, there is an interest rate to be charged, but the financial return isn't the focus, right? The focus has always been on what's the impact. And ones like Evergreen, we sort of led the way, haven't we, in not just looking at the environmental, and that's obviously really important, but we've looked at the social and the economical benefits as well, right from the start. And I think those elements, it just shows the power of what these developments can do. Look at Evergreen, right? What did we start as? It was 50 million. Right, if memory serves. It's now 3 times that because of its success, constantly reinvesting, never lost a penny. But we don't look back at what's been the IRR. We look back at what have we achieved from those ESG metrics, right? Pick a handful off the top of my head, right? 300 acres of brownfield remediated. Great, really pleased with that one. Jobs,
Fantastic.
How much was the jobs? That was at least, I think, probably another 30,000 jobs, something like that. And tons of CO2, 11,000, if memory serves. So these are big things, I think we're tremendously proud of that. And that's not even counting things like what's the contribution to a local community that these impact funds can have. We're doing some schemes right now, aren't we? Take, again, I don't like to name them, it's not fair because you're choosing favourites. But, the one we just closed quite recently, the amount of space that it has in it that'll be given over to the local community for a theatre to come in there, a local school to use, fabulous stuff,
Yeah.
And I think, when you stand back and you do the investment and it gets repaid, it's things like that, I talked about this theme at the beginning, Andrew, being bittersweet, some of it, but that's the sweet stuff. That stuff makes you feel really happy about what you've been part of, right?
Yeah, no, and I think, from our perspective, and apologies for only being able to talk locally, but, we've set up these funds and, 9,500 houses have been supported through the investments that we made through the investment fund alongside, the evergreen impact funds, and actually it is those wider community benefits. But one of the other things that actually it helps create is to support regeneration plans. We create an income stream that helps support our own activity from a local authority perspective, so that we can actually create skills to actually drive forward regeneration projects. So I think it's, we're on the place stand. I think it's sort of very important to understand that actually all these things are interconnected rather than being a set of individual sort of policy objectives that people are trying to deliver in isolation. These are all very much interrelated, and I think Andy's point on transport really is an enabler for growth. How do we actually think about a whole place plan such that we are benefiting from the connectivity that we can create from the transport infrastructure? Because actually it's the growth creation and value creation that we can generate by good quality placemaking and regeneration, but surrounded around good quality transport connectivity, that will start to address our challenges around economic growth. And I know Darryl was talking about this sort of shift to net zero, but actually that feels perverse in my mind, because without the value growth, we don't actually have the financing to come in to pay for the funding to pay for the net zero. So actually, if we're not focusing on the two together, then actually we won't achieve the sort of wider outcomes and benefits that we want to achieve, which, I think from my point of view, we've got PFA about to be adopted. It's a great platform for moving forward. It's going to be a really tough market, and we need to continue to use these flexible models. So I think it's, we got other great examples of where, it's not about new all the time, it's about existing and how do we repurpose. So we've invested in impact funds which are acquiring properties to serve as accommodation for homelessness and to address supported housing needs. So actually it's that wider picture which actually impact funds can help, as well as the new build side of it as well. So continues to be massively important in a wider GM context. Andy sort of set the scene yesterday, but places at the heart of it. And the questions moving forward is, how do we continue to be innovative and novel, and how do we get the crowding in that Jeremy talked about from institutional investors that appreciate what good placemaking can actually drive from a value point of view.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. The crowding in one is a challenge because, you don't have to be focused on return. We with Evergreen or other impact funds, we don't have to be focused on return, but a lot of other people do, and they need to square that off. But I am hopeful, actually. I'm hopeful. The trend we see in the market, the trend we see from other capital providers is that they are sensitive to that. If anyone's trying to raise a fund right now, I don't think they can raise money if they don't have a bona fide ESG strategy that is really going to actually work. Not tokenistic, it has to work. And actually, quite surprisingly, it surprised me, ESG has rapidly become the norm, not the exception. I think anyone raising capital will have to commit to these things. So I think that will help the crowding in, because these schemes are magnetised to the impact funds. They're drawn to them, and other capital want to come in. And I think that will be the interesting trend to watch. Can it happen fast enough? We talked a lot about Manchester. But I want to say we talked a lot about GM for a reason, right? I think GM has led the way in terms of these interesting funding conduits, right? To plug the gap that the private sector won't fill, right? Yeah. And I think they've been exciting. They've been brilliant. Definitely led the way. Definitely the exemplar for the rest of the country. But there are good things in the rest of the country as well. And I want to make sure, even though I said at the beginning, it's sad, there's not a lot of private sector development finance out there. What I love about the public sector, it will plug the gap as best it can itself, and that developer community will as well. But elsewhere in the country, you've got the Cardiff City Region Fund, you've got the Northern Ireland Investment Fund, you've got the one in South Yorkshire. There's loads of them springing up, doing things locally. So actually the pattern, I think, is really exciting.
Yeah. And, I think from my point of view, there's lots to be learned from those places, that I can learn from what they're doing, because actually everyone's come up with innovative approaches. But I do think that whole, how do we deal with the wall of capital that's supposedly looking for places to invest, and how do we ensure that actually we've got the right advisory support around bringing those schemes forward, and time will tell, I suppose, the extent to which investors have got a role to play in terms of twisting the arm of developers. Yeah. Because actually, if the money's not there because they're not meeting the ESG credentials, then how are we going to meet our net zero targets? Actually, it's if investors are more forceful through that ESG angle and lens when they're making investment decisions, and actually that will support what would be a local authority and national government policy sort of direction of travel with how we actually deliver our net zero objectives. So there's a need for a system-wide approach that will channel everyone towards the outcomes that we want to achieve.
Yeah, and I'd say, if we were to, I think we've got to draw this to a close now, because I can see Laura in the periphery of my vision. Angry for that. But I think if we were to draw it to a close, how do you feel? I'll tell you how I feel, then I'll let you wrap it up. I feel, okay, we haven't got, a fully active, fully functioning, bells and whistles, development finance market led by the private sector. That's a shame. Okay. We also haven't got our fireside for the fireside chat. That's okay. But what we have got some fantastic pockets, right, that are making things happen, and they're to be celebrated, because they're making things happen, and there's great ESG credentials, the right buildings are going up, and impact's happening. And I think we should celebrate that, and it rolls out the template, don't you think? Yeah,
no, massively. I think my sentiment is we've got a burning platform to jump from. We've got a bunch of policies everyone's trying to deliver. There's a looming election, which I know from an infrastructure point of view may not change direction of travel, but from a local authority perspective, actually, there's a point to reset and engage. We've got all the people that need to work in a systematic approach to actually address the challenges we've got. So I'm feeling really positive, despite possibly a bit of a hiatus while the election happens. Actually, really positive for the future moving forward, albeit challenges. But if it was easy, we probably wouldn't be sitting here, would we? So.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Well, you're going to keep sitting here because you're on the panel. I'm now going to go, and we'll invite the panelists and the moderator up. But thanks for listening to us. Really appreciate that. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
We go.
Where are we going?
Where do you want us?
Either?
You two pick a chair.
There we go.
Great, thank you. I'd just like to, first of all, thank the panel for joining me back on stage so we can move the discussion forward and expand a little more. For those of you in the audience who don't know me, I'm Catherine Burks. I'm a Senior Director in CBRE's Development Advisory business. My background is strategic development, particularly transport-led regeneration with public and private sectors coming together. And that's mainly from my role when I was Development Director at LCR. So we would encourage audience participation at this point in the morning. So if anybody does have a question, please just raise your hand, and we have a number of people around the room who will come with a microphone, and I'll bring you in at the appropriate time. I've already seen 2 hands shoot up. So there's a gentleman here and a gentleman here on the corner as well. I do want to theme part of this conversation, but seeing as your hands shot up straight away, is the panel comfortable if we go straight to questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Okay. And if you'd just like to introduce yourself a little bit, say your name and background, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for taking the question. So Chris Fry from Accela, we're all about accelerating the green transition around built, natural environment and how those things come together. And the question, I guess, is, we had the opening session yesterday, or the session I first arrived at anyway, was around resilience and climate resilience. And sort of thinking about, does that just complicate this debate even more in terms of how investors react to that in terms of asset life, etc. So we're working with some real estate clients that are sort of finding that, the assumed design life of certain assets is not right because of the pounding that those buildings are getting in terms of heat and also heavy rainfall, etc. And then the flip side of that is where natural capital fits into that. So here in Manchester, the interplay between the natural environment and how using that more intelligently can protect the built environment assets as well. So natural flood management, etc., either upstream or within the city itself, and green and blue infrastructure. Where does that play into making these investment and these walls of capital line up better, or does it just complicate it even further?
Well, I think there's a lot of content in there. Darryl, would you like to kick us off at all around?
It's a very rich point there. I think maybe I'll just repeat it back because you offered it. I do think it is complicated, right? If I start with the resilience point, so this is a feature we see. I mean, work across the real assets area for us, which is real estate and infrastructure. But there are common themes developing. So only last week, in fact, I had a client talk about slightly odd. You get these odd questions now and again, which is germane to this, which was how much are you considering flood risk in your investments? It was kind of, a little bit sort of left field. Actually, it was someone in Aviva, so it was to know better. But the point being is that, if I look at just taking one facet of what you're saying about physical risk, even that is, in our answer to that, perhaps wasn't that compelling, but go, well, okay, we're doing a level of diligence and we're trying to rely that the industry and our technical advisors, etc., are keeping up with that. But it's something we're alive to. Obviously, in real estate and infrastructure assets, which are locally based, we've been trying to look at how we develop some of the technology we have on the insurance side into that in terms of flood, probably more sophisticated looking at flood risk, just in an example. Broader climate basis is very challenging. And I have to say, I don't think there's a really good answer to this, because I think we're going into the unknown on this point. I just think also there's a pragmatism around what can you deal with first. We're kind of ground zero, meaning you'll be aware in real estate, I think there's, I'd like to differentiate the two, there's such a big gap between real estate and infrastructure in some respects, because ESG, if I dare I suggest, is kind of new in real estate. What I know is a much more profound impact, meaning energy supply and efficiency is the big focus. And that's taking a lot of time and effort. Some of the other part about resilience is probably not being considered fully on that basis. One quick point about natural capital. This is a very broad thing. We're in a process of launching a natural capital fund. When I say that, it's very similar to what Jeremy mentioned, earlier around, initial investments we've been doing have been much more about carbon, therefore the investments into forestry. The point is how that develops further in terms of carbon removal. So our natural capital focus is going to be about carbon removal and carbon offsets effectively, which is going to be a market in itself, rather than necessarily the linkage into the built environment. But that's just my perspective.
Well, I was just going to say, your question feels like my world at the moment, because if I take my particular sector, which is retrofit, I'm immediately brought to mind last week I was meeting with the Department for Education and talking about retrofitting schools. And from a UK infrastructure bank perspective, from a wider government perspective, we're nervous about doing the easy stuff that's commercial, because that leaves a legacy problem which is even harder to finance. So what do I mean by that? So you can put solar on roofs and generate a revenue stream, which in lots of cases will be enough to pay back the cost of putting the solar on the roof in the first place. But if you're not also looking at it from an insulation perspective, converting gas boilers to heat pumps, which are good net zero things, but don't generate a revenue stream like the solar does, so I've sat in our initial credit committees talking about businesses that want to put solar on domestic properties and getting pushback saying, well, are we just creating a problem for the future? We're much more interested in financing people that have got a commercial opportunity for the whole building. But you're absolutely right. It factors in everything we do. And another example is we've put some money into a gigafactory in the northeast, which you would think was a net zero story from our perspective. That's one of our prime objectives. But actually the conclusion of our policy and impact team was that wasn't necessarily a net zero story, producing EV batteries for vehicles, because 80% of the vehicles being built in the UK are exported. So it's good for the climate, but it's not good for UK climate. So it became much more of a regional, local economic growth story. So, yeah, we are all trying to balance on a pinhead to get these things to work.
Andrew?
Yeah, I suppose just from a regional context, we're baking in's probably wrong. We have included within Places for Everyone biodiversity net gain targets 10%, net zero policy objectives 2028, it'll be mandatory for a net zero housing delivery in a GM context. So I think part of the challenge though is how do you actually pay for it? It's back to the funding financing point, and it's a place question of, well, how do you build that into doing everything in a place and regen context that means that you're driving values to create the revenue streams to actually pay for it? Because the great objectives to have, but actually we've got to get into, but how do you achieve them in practical terms? And the feels like the challenge that Jeremy's dealing with is exactly the one that we deal with, which is, look, you've got five technology types that can all fit in a building, and everyone could individually finance them, and then for some bizarre reason it's not innovative to do all five together, but yet no one can do it. So you've kind of got the innovation people looking at things that are new and wacky that are definitely not getting funded, and everyone misses the bit in the middle, which is the commercialisation of a package of measures that really makes the difference, because people feel like they should be deliverable by the market. But the reality is, if they were deliverable by the market, we'd have so much more delivery than we currently do. So I think there's a mismatch of expectations and policy support through the cycle, from sort of innovation, idea generation, through to actual commercial reality, and how you bring these things forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. Can we go to this gentleman at the front, please, Holly?
Good morning, panel. Dave Bedell from Octavius Infrastructure. Point of clarity or perhaps additional context from Jeremy first. I noticed on the slide of existing investments that transportation was by far the smallest bubble there, and I'm just curious as to whether that is reflective of the number of applications from that sector, or whether it resonates with the attractiveness of the investment itself. And then more broadly to the panel, and I think it was Darryl who mentioned the taboo subject of PFI2. If you had a blank sheet of paper and carte blanche, what would PFI3 look like, please?
So shall I pick up first on the why was the transport bubble small? Yeah. I'm not the director that leads on transport, so apologies to Rob Minter if I get this slightly wrong. I think there's a combination of reasons. So we are doing transport stuff. We're concentrating at the moment primarily on electric buses and EV charging, because those are the opportunities we've got. They tend to be relatively small. We have a minimum ticket, I don't think I mentioned, of 25 million, and that's partly because we've got a lot of money to deploy, but partly because bigger deals take just as long as smaller deals, so we might as well do bigger ones. I think there's also an issue in the transport sector that where it is, some of the really big transport schemes are not seeking private finance, and some of the sectors are well banked. So I know we've got an opportunity at the moment for a big rolling stock transaction, and the first question we've got is, why are we involved? Because we shouldn't be involved where the market can cope with it. Our chief executive likes to say we have no effective competition, because if we had competition, we shouldn't be playing in that market. That's not what we're there to do. We're not crowding out people who can lend.
Could I just ask a follow-up on that, around the sort of transport element in particular, and UK IB, in that there's an advisory arm of the bank as well, isn't there? And they're heavily involved in this. Well, what I picked up on the slide earlier was, a lot of the transport projects, mass transit, etc., are in that advisory piece. So I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more for the audience on that arm of the bank. So
our advisory team is wholly advisory for local authorities, but it is free. So please, if you come from a local authority, please use them. And yes, they probably are talking to local authorities about transport schemes. But in advisory capacity, obviously, when it doesn't turn up as a bubble because we've not lent any money.
Great, thank you. Should we
revisit? Can I give a very? I'll give my very quick answer to the last one. Sorry, it's a hot topic, and many others have a view on this, and it's going to be idealistic, I will admit. And I'm going to sit here. We've got about 2 billion of PFI debt on our books, so it's easy for me to say this. We're the good guys in this. The bad guys are frankly all over us in terms of the private sector. But the bottom line is the private sector's done a pretty shoddy job on PFI, so it's our own fault. We've got this. We are where we are. That's the equity in particular, I'd say, and also the contractors who've done pretty shoddy jobs in a number of cases. What would you do differently? I think this is back to, I think Andrew's point again about the Nirvana point with carriers going on. You need a model which is, this is incredibly cheesy, I know, but genuinely we have to find a better partnership model. The PFI deals are not partnerships. There has to be a long-term partnership. The initial build's fine, but at the moment you've got, classically government would say this as well, a kind of shell company managing these assets with investors sat in London, not really connected. I would say you build it up with much greater partnership with a real entity that's alive and kicking through the life of the asset. The problem line is the risk transfer is just costing too much, so you need a much more dynamic model, possibly different, more flexible model during the life of the asset, and you definitely need more community engagement. So, you should be giving a lot more, there should be, and there is a shades of this in the Welsh PPP model that where it's alive and kicking to some degree. But again, you can involve the community much more. I'd like to see community funding opportunities into that. There's no reason why you couldn't have a small amount of money come from crowdfunding. So I just think you need more community engagement and a more living and breathing real public-private partnership. And I know we've spent, and all collectively here, a number of people here have probably used the sort of, we need to put the third P in PPP. We've never delivered that, right? So somehow the model doesn't need a radical shift, it needs a change in mindset.
Andrew?
Yeah, only just agree very much with Darryl. I mean, it's the joint venture type arrangement. The only people that seem to win out of complicated contracts are lawyers because they spend hours redrafting complicated clauses, where actually what we need is that actual true sense of partnership, which is possibly a bit more like public sector equity investment, where we're sitting around the board table agreeing how we address challenges as they materialise, rather than trying to preempt the variety of challenges that are going to materialise over a 20, 25 year sort of time horizon. So, again, some of the investments that we make, I'm the director in a house building company off of one of the equity investments that we've made, and actually that, from my own experience, that works much better because we can, influence at a board level the decisions that are taken and not feel like you've got a menu of things that are going to cost you an arm and a leg to change later on down the contract.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. We probably only have time for one more question. So yes, this gentleman here.
Martin Turner from Manchester Economic Forecasting. Excuse me. Short question. Does anyone have operational independence from the Treasury? So if one of the goals of UKIB is to unlock the wall of capital and crowd in investment, then it really needs to go to the riskiest places. The Treasury likes to see a return, doesn't like to be too risky, quite controlling. I know because I used to work for them. How do you kind of really de facto balance that in the States where institutions like ARPA and DARPA who can really go into the risky areas? Do you effectively have operational independence of the Treasury, I suppose?
So the answer is yes, we're set up to be operationally independent. We have some thresholds. I can't quite remember the numbers, but I think any transaction, I think I'm right in saying that is up to 250 million, we can do completely in-house without reference to Treasury. There is a debate with Treasury that goes on sometimes around, we get an annual strategic steer from Treasury. This is where we would like you to focus your investment. And we have some operational interaction with Treasury because, for example, our guarantee product, we issue a guarantee, we are considered sovereign, but there's a backup guarantee from the Treasury to make sure we've got the money to pay it and we are sovereign, which has been a legal fund for the lawyers. And there's a practical thing about how quickly, if the guarantee was called, can we actually get money if we've not got it currently in our bank account, because we have to go to the Treasury to get it. So it might take 5 days instead of 1 day or whatever for a typical bank. So there's a few of those, but we are operationally independent. We have to report annually to the Public Accounts Committee, and naturally the National Audit Office is going to crawl all over us. But yeah, it doesn't feel like the Treasury's got its fingers in any pies. And to pick up your point about the sort of risk taking, I think one of the reasons a lot of the people like me who are ex-commercial bankers worked there is I sat too often when I used to work for Lloyds thinking this is a great project, but I'm not going to get this through credit. And the ability to take a little bit more risk is attractive for that reason. And I think most of us are also green-minded and wanting to improve the UK. So there's definitely a mindset of let's try and make stuff happen. We still also, we're all ex-commercial bankers, so we know what a good deal looks like, and we've got to make some money, otherwise we can't pay our salaries. So, you know, there's a balance. Sorry,
Great.
I think we're getting out of time.
No, it's fine. It's all good discussion, and I'm pleased that the audience have had an opportunity to raise their questions. We haven't got into any of my themes, which has made my job very easy. Just, Daryl, Andrew, have you got any concluding comments, anything that you'd like to flag to the audience?
No, I think, sorry, you get sort of reflective, don't you, in these sort of things. So my big thing, everyone's heard the sort of themes, but I think all I say supporting the idea of Ben, thanks to yourselves, CBRE, the discussion is important. I think I'm still a big fan of, there's a sort of triangle of entities in the market generally, right, which is basically government, the financial markets and sponsors. And I say sponsors meaning developers and people actually do things rather than just provide money. And I think too often everyone has a sort of bilateral conversation and often talks past each other. So anything where you bring those three parties into discussion has to be a good thing. And I think it probably doesn't happen enough. That would be my just general point as a takeaway.
Andrew?
I mean, my reflection on it is, you know, even with devolution, single settlement, a GM context, we'll still be constrained by spending review windows. And actually, if we want to deliver the ambition that everyone's got, what we need is that longer term certainty over actually devolved control, so we can set up structures that we can actually play through over time. Development, infrastructure, they're not short term games to play in, they're a long term investment, and that's both at the upfront development end and in the actual delivery of it. So actually the cycles that work in politically are challenging alongside the treasury controls. So anything we can do to stretch that out, the better.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that brings this session to a close. I just want to express my thanks to the panel. So Daryl, Jeremy, Andrew, thank you so much for your preparation and contributions as well. I think it's safe to say there's still a lot to talk about, a lot of debate, a lot of discussion from a variety of people in the room. We'd like to continue that debate and conversation. I'm around for the rest of today, this afternoon, so if there's anyone that wants to come and flag anything with me that we can pick up perhaps later on from a CBRE perspective, or perhaps with our panel members, please do come and find me. So thank you.
Thank you.